She threw me out the day after David's funeral. I still hear the scrape of that kitchen chair in my head, like proof that you can be alive and utterly invisible at the same time. And some of them laughed. They didn't know what was coming next. I did not know either. Not then. But there were papers. There were plans. There was David, even after he was gone. If you like comeback stories, hit subscribe and stay with me. The part where everyone thinks they have the last word comes later. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. I can tell you the exact time because it is burned into me, the way grief burns things. When a clock becomes a witness, you know the world has shifted. My hand smacked against the nightstand before my brain had a chance to understand what was happening. The voice on the other end was Stephanie's, tight and sharp. "He's not breathing," she said. "Call 911. I dressed without thinking. You move with a kind of machine urgency in those minutes. Shoes, jacket, keys. And the world outside could have been two different cities. The streetlights were the same, but everything felt unreal. David had been my boy and my friend. He had taken forever to decide on a coffee brand and on paint colors. He could agonize over a birthday card and then surprise you by being the first to bring flowers. He planned things. That was his way of loving, to leave a trail of plans and to notch the details so that the people he cared for would stumble into safety if they had to. The hospital smelled like bleach and lemon. It smelled like everyone else's prayers. I remember the way the lights over the corridor made the linoleum shine, how the nurse's shoes squeaked too loud for the hour, how a monitor flatlined into a different kind of silence. Stephanie met me in the emergency waiting room with eyes like glass. She was precise that morning, too composed for the kind of event that had hollowed me out. She kept saying practical things. The funeral arrangements? Call your sister, as if she were checking off a to-do list. People drifted in and out like moths at a porch light. Family you expect, and family you are surprised to see. Marcus was there, his face red from driving or from trying not to cry. I couldn't always tell the difference with those men. There were quiet prayers, the grip of hands, the awkwardness of neighbors who recycle the same condolence phrases until they become nonsense. "I'm sorry," they said. "If you need anything." There were hymns sung softly in a chapel that seemed to have lost its echo. There were roses, too many roses, and a program with David's name printed in simple, modest font. Stephanie stood beside the casket the way someone stands at the edge of a pond watching a ripple. She helped arrange the photos on the table. She smiled in that professional way people smile when a camera is on them. It was a practice smile, the kind that keeps one's face warm, but doesn't touch the eyes.
When Aunt Joan tried to pin a corsage, Stephanie turned it down and said, "We'll do something more modern," as if the funeral could be curated like a magazine spread. Small things matter. Small thorns show the whole rose. At the visitation, I caught her removing a photograph from the mantel where David had left it last Christmas, just sliding it back into a box as if it were clutter. She told me we wanted to keep things tidy, and there was a tone to it, a possessive neatness that did not sound like grief. She murmured to someone about old paperwork and clearing things up. I heard it and told myself I was being unfair. Who wouldn't want the house put in order? Who wouldn't want to make things easier on everyone? I kept leaning into charity because that is what mothers do. We give people the benefit of the doubt until there is no longer any doubt to be had. The funeral itself was a blur, in the kind of slow-motion grief that stretches minutes into an ocean. People recited things about David that made my chest feel both swollen and hollow. He loved his dog. He baked bread on Sundays. He always fixed the leaky faucet in the neighbor's place. We sang the old hymns that make even unbelievers think of home. There was a line in the booklet about peace, and I clutched it like a life preserver. Everyone hugged me the way you hug someone who has broken a bone. Careful, polite, like you could do more damage than good. After the service, there are rituals that seem designed to let people leave in neat groups. Handshakes, casseroles, polite departures. Stephanie's family clustered close to her, and she spoke in that cool, efficient whisper. No one expected, not then, that the clock would roll over from mourning to logistics so quickly. I thought the worst thing I might face would be the empty house at night, the way David's side of the bed kept saying his name in the shape of the pillow. I was wrong. The worst thing came the day after the funeral. It was afternoon when she came into my kitchen like she owned my house. She moved with a briskness that made me step back. It wasn't loud, she didn't scream. She sat down at my table, poured coffee that I didn't think to refuse, and opened her mouth with the calm of someone reading a list. "We've made arrangements," she said, and I remember the way the words sounded like final nails. She said it as if this were an administrative update. "You can stay for a week or two if you want, but the mortgage needs to be handled, and Marcus and I are going to oversee the sale." "What?" I said, because that's what your brain gives you when your heart isn't ready to agree with your ears. "It's best for all of us," she said, watching me for assent. She had a folded paper, some checklist, I thought. She was precise in her phrasing. "We'll get the best offer. We'll clear out the old things, Eleanor. It's not practical to live here alone." Eleanor. She had always used my name with that little formal tinge, like a ledger.
She didn't say, "Mom." It stung. "Who asked you to do this?" I asked. My voice felt small and brittle. "Your son," she said. "He wanted things tidy. He wrote that down. He arranged for some of the money to go into investments. I'm helping carry out his wishes." That would have been one thing if she had spoken like a woman sharing pain. It would have been different if she had said, "We don't know what to do without him." Instead, she spoke like an executor who had checked boxes and cleared emails. There was a cold professionalism that didn't sit with places that were once lived in. They gave me a timeline. "Pack what you need. The rest will be sold or donated. We will find you somewhere until the house sells. We will help." When you were told you have to pack your life in 4 suitcases, you do it with the mechanical precision of someone moving through a storm. I packed his sweaters, the mugs that had been his, the little notes he'd left in drawers, things that smelled faintly of him and made my hands ache. How do you choose what to keep? How do you choose which pieces of your shared history you are allowed to bring with you? I shoved sweaters into plastic bags. I wrapped the picture frames in towels. I put away the mismatched spoons in a single box. 4 suitcases, as they had specified. 1 for clothes, 1 for documents, 1 for the kitchen things, 1 for what they politely called memorabilia. They were efficient. Marcus moved faster than I expected, hauling boxes into their car like a man doing yard work. Stephanie supervised with the air of someone managing a project timeline. She was courteous in that way that hides a sharper edge. "We'll get everything listed right away. We'll have someone to come and take the bigger things. We don't want any of it sitting for weeks." When I asked where they expected me to stay, Stephanie suggested a few places with the calm of someone reciting options. "There's a motel on Route 9, she said. "Not fancy, but clean. You can stay there until we find something." She looked at me with a touch of sympathy that was carefully measured. I felt like an extra chair in a house. The family had the main room. I was the fold-out. They loaded my car for me, as if I were too frail to carry my own box. They smiled while they did it. The lipstick on Stephanie's cheek matched the car's leather in a way that made me feel smaller. At the motel, the room had a floral bedspread and a television with buttons that didn't work. The carpet had a pattern designed to hide stains. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the world outside that siren-swept highway and tried to remember which of David's shirts smelled the most like him. The humiliation was slow and quiet. People sent casseroles and sympathy cards. Neighbors came by to offer help. "If there's anything you need, please call," they said. And that is what made the eviction sting the most. Everyone was kind, but none of them did anything to stop what had been done. Not because they didn't care, but because the thing that had been done looked like a reasonable arrangement. Family stepping in to manage an estate. Without documents in hand, perception becomes truth. I spent the first night rehearsing what I might say if anyone had the decency to ask why I was gone. I cycled through memories until the sunlight came gold through the blind and turned my little motel room into a box of light. I thrust my hands into cold water and thought of David's laugh and the odd habits he had that made a house feel like a home. My grief at that point had many shapes: a raw, open ache that lived in one place, a dull, steady fury that grew like a weed, and a small, stubborn candle of something else: resolve. I would not let myself be erased. That candle lit more than just sentiment. David had always been the sort of son who wrote things down. He kept lists. He made notes in his phone. He saved emails. He would say, half joking, that you couldn't expect people to follow your wishes by memory alone. You had to leave them a map. It annoyed him that people thought of planning as morbid. He called it responsible. He called it love. A week after the funeral, my phone buzzed with a number I did not know. The lawyer, James Morrison, called. I heard the paper rustle in the background like a scene setter. "Miss Hart?" he said. I hadn't been called Hart in public yet, and his use of the formal name felt like a brass button being buttoned. "This is James Morrison, attorney for the late David Hart." Yes, I said. My voice felt as if belonged to someone 70 years younger. I'm calling because you are specifically named in an amendment dated February 15th. David left instructions that you be present for the reading of the will and that certain assets be handled in a particular manner. I understand what people mean when they tell you that when the universe hands you a small mercy, it can feel like a stone. On the one hand, here was evidence that David thought of me. On the other hand, the timing of it, after someone had already shaken my life like a piggy bank, was a strange consolation. He wrote it? I asked. He amended his will on February 15th, Mr. Morrison said. There is also a safety deposit box that he designated for you. You'll need to come to the office for the reading. It's best that you be there. I told him I would be there. I didn't know yet how much David had left in words, in numbers, in hard-drawn lines. I only knew a man who, even in life, preferred the quiet architecture of plans to the drama of improvisation. When the lawyer hung up, I sat for a long time in that motel with the television muting like an ocean in the background. My phone lay heavy on the nightstand like a small, secret sun. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee.
I thought of the $40,000 I had once lent David for a down payment when he moved into that house 10 years earlier. A loan I had never meant to be more than a hand up. He'd promised to pay me back when he could, in small installments, the way he had promised everything, on time, conscientiously. That $40,000 had been a family thing, a way we helped each other. It returned to my mind like a ledger that needed balancing. There is a particular indignity to being pushed out of your own home and then finding out the person who did it was counting on your silence. For a few days, I floated between anger and grief, between the memory of David cutting the cake at his 42nd birthday and the sharpness of Stephanie's, "We must be practical." My friends told me to let it go, to be grateful for the fact that I had some place to sleep. My sister called and said, maybe they're doing what's best, and I did what daughters and wives are taught. I gave the benefit of the doubt. But gratitude and being taken for granted are not the same thing. The lawyer's office smelled of coffee and paper. Mr. Morrison was a man with careful hair and careful hands. He steered the conversation with the certainty of someone used to guiding other people's tragedies into legal prose. Stephanie arrived with her brother Marcus, who kept offering awkward, sorrow-laced smiles to me, as if we were performing at the same funeral. They sat like people who had already divided the room in their minds. Stephanie placed a small leather folder on the table and smoothed its edges. Marcus watched the door like a man waiting for a bus. There was an air of quiet confidence about them, the kind that tells you they had already imagined the end before the meeting had started. Miss Hart, Mr. Morrison began, there is an amendment dated February 15th. It names certain beneficiaries and references a safety deposit box. He glanced at me the way someone offers a lifeline and then retreats to watch how it is caught. He read with his courthouse voice, the kind of voice that flattens surprises into statements. David named you as a beneficiary to certain assets. He also left instructions for a letter to be placed in a sealed envelope in his safety deposit box, to be opened by you upon his death. The room felt suddenly too small. I could hear the hum of the light, the scratch of a pen somewhere on a pad. Stephanie's face did something I hadn't seen in a while. It tightened, a quick hardening around the mouth. She didn't look surprised. She looked annoyed, as if someone had sent her a notice she hadn't expected in her mail. Is there an amount? Marcus asked before Mr. Morrison could finish. His voice had the brittle quality of people who have been rehearsing desire like prayer. There are accounts listed, Mr. Morrison said. One shows several investments. The total balance listed in the accounts we have on hand is approximately $185,000. It landed with the soft thud of something heavy. The number has a way of making even funerals look like business meetings. There was silence, long enough for a kettle to boil. I had known, vaguely, that David had been saving. He had set aside little amounts, $1 on payday, a small drip into an investment account. He often joked about being thrifty, but hearing the number read made something steady and practical within him speak through paper and signatures. So, Stephanie began, as if a plan were being rewritten on the fly. How soon can we access it? Does it help with the mortgage? Mr. Morrison adjusted his glasses. The accounts are in David's name. There are instructions. There is also a safety deposit box at First City Bank. The box contains a sealed envelope with a letter from David, and there are bank documents that outline the account balances. We will need to access the box through the proper procedures. Mrs. Peterson at the bank can assist with that. Mrs. Peterson. I had met her briefly years ago when David had opened an account. She was the kind of manager who kept a cardigan on the back of her chair and nodded in a way that made you feel seen. I imagined her sliding across a key, stamping a ledger, and then leaning forward to speak in that soft, confidential manner banks have developed to make you trust them with your secrets. Stephanie, of course, tried to seed the conversation into her own expectation.
We should be able to withdraw as needed, she said, speaking like someone familiar with spreadsheets and expenses. There are bills, there are things that have to be settled, my brother and I can manage. I watched them move through the vocabulary of entitlement. It was an old dance. Someone offers to help, and the help is a takeover. I kept my hands folded in my lap and listened to the words being said. Mr. Morrison continued, careful and calm, like a man reading the weather report. He put the facts down and left the people to decide how they felt about them. You should be present when the box is opened, he said. The will was amended in February. That amendment names specific recipients in the event of his death. We'll proceed in a way that respects his wishes. The mention of the amendment again made my chest tighten. February 15th. The date sat in my mind like a signpost someone else had planted. I tried to summon the scene where David might have sat at his kitchen table, pen in hand, thinking of contingencies. Who would he trust with certain things? Who needed protection? The little habits he'd had of making notes suddenly read like a map he had left for me. I wanted to cry again, but I wanted also to be practical. He would have wanted both. After the attorney's office, life reconfigured like a puzzle whose pieces had been shuffled. There were phone calls with Mrs. Peterson, emails arranged for an appointment at the bank, and the quiet hum of neighbors dropping off loaves of bread. People wanted to make me feel less alone, and they did in their way.
But inside me, the indignity of the eviction kept clanging like a small bell that would not stop ringing. At the motel, I started to make lists. Not the kind of lists of memories, though there were many of those, but lists of things I needed. Copies of documents, any correspondence David might have had about the house, bank statements, evidence of the $40,000 down payment I had helped him with. It is astonishing what grief does to your thinking. It did not steal my memory of numbers. If anything, it sharpened it. Figures that once seemed merely administrative now functioned as lifelines. Christine from church brought over an envelope labeled Documents, and inside were faded copies of receipts and a canceled check that bore my name and the amount $40,000. It wasn't a dramatic thing, no flourish, no declaration, but it was a ledger line with my name on it. When you are fighting for the right to exist in your son's life and in the house he left, a piece of paper can be heavier than rhetoric. The days passed with a rhythm of appointments, calls, and small indignities. Each time I looked at my phone, anxiety rose like tidewater. I went to the bank when Mr. Morrison suggested. Mrs. Peterson recognized me, and she offered me a small smile that felt like a bench in a storm. The bank's vault looked like a cathedral of metal. They had forms and procedures, they had signatures to verify and protocols to follow. I was not naive about what a safety deposit box could contain, but the thought that David had left me something, that he had thought ahead enough to put a letter inside a sealed envelope, steadied me in a way I did not expect. There was an odd, guilty pleasure to being right in my suspicion that David knew what he was doing. It felt like vindication in miniature, that he had thought to protect me from the very sort of people who would see my grief as an opportunity. But it was not vengeance. David's planning was not meant to humiliate, it was meant to preserve dignity. That was his way, practical, generous, and careful with the people he loved. Living in a motel, carrying 4 suitcases, and the weight of a household's memories, taught me a new kind of resilience. People who have not been displaced by grief cannot quite understand the particular humiliation of explaining to anyone who asks that your belongings are in a storage unit or a neighbor's garage while someone else organizes what used to be your life. There is a quiet loop of confusion and pity that follows you like a shadow. At night, I would sit and make plans in my head, not for revenge, never that, but for survival. I wrote down names and dates. I save emails on a dedicated folder on my phone, mortgage statements, the canceled check for the down payment, every small note that referenced the house. I began to understand that care can take the shape of records. The hum of bureaucracy became oddly a comfort. Proof is a kind of armor.
Then came the day the lawyer asked us all to come to his office to read the will. Stephanie arrived with a surgical neatness, a dress that matched her posture. She extended a hand and offered condolences with a smile that was a little too practiced. Marcus hovered like a man who had been primed for a particular role. I walked in with my clutch of documents and the folded-up receipts. People tend to think wills are dramatic, the kind of moment that should fill a part room and make people weep. Most of the time, it is not. Most of the time, it's a ledger and signatures, ink and dates. But this time it felt charged, like a hush settling over a room before a storm. Mr. Morrison sat with the amendment in front of him. He had the ability to make paper sound like consequence. He read the basic instructions aloud, the names of people, the parcels of property, the investments. And then he paused and put the amendment on the table in such a way that the crease divided us. "Miss Hart," he said, "David left an envelope in a safety deposit box. He asked that it be opened by you." He tapped the page as if to point to a sentence. "There is also documentation of account balances, approximately $185,000, spread across several investments." I felt the room tilt for a second. Stephanie's face didn't go pale, it went tight. She smiled the smile of someone recalculating. "And what does the envelope say?" she asked, as if the contents had been an accessory rather than the point. Mr. Morrison did not answer immediately. "We will follow procedure," he said. "The box is at First City Bank. Mrs. Peterson will assist. I would advise that you be present when it is opened." It was a small victory to be asked to be present. It implied that somewhere between his pens and David's signatures, David had thought to make a place for me. It meant he had not forgotten that his mother existed. That alone felt like a small, sacred thing. On my way out of the office, Stephanie put a hand briefly to my elbow. "We'll help with the mortgage," she said. Her voice was slick with promise. I looked at her then, really looked, and saw a flash of calculation behind the kind face. I thought of the photograph she had removed, of the polite, businesslike eviction, and I felt the line between polite help and possession. I left the office with the date again beating in my head, February 15th, and with the knowledge that there was a box at First City Bank with a key and a sealed envelope that might at last explain what David had meant to do. The curtains of the motel brushed the window and let in a soft light. A stranger next door had left a radio playing low. For the first time since the funeral, a small pulse of hope and a fierce protectiveness woke in me. If David had made a provision, then it was my duty to see it through. He wasn't around to speak for himself. The paper would have to do his speaking. I packed the documents into my bag like a soldier gathering maps.
The canceled check with my name on it, the receipts Christine had found, copies of the mortgage payments, each item pinned me down in a world that otherwise felt like adrift. I had been humiliated, yes, but humiliation and truth are different beasts. Truth, when found, can do things that anger cannot. It can restore what was taken. The drive to the bank was a small, quiet thing. The seatbelt pressed against my chest. The radio stopped being background noise and became a metronome that slowed my breath. The bank's doors swung open with that mechanical confidence banks breed, and there stood Mrs. Peterson, her cardigan neat on her shoulders, and her face the equivalent of a friendly ledger. We would have to sign forms. We would have to verify identities. We would have to wait while official stamps moved like ritual dancers. There would be procedure for opening a safety deposit box. All of that was true and necessary. I knew that. I also knew, with that odd emotional certainty that comes when you have been loved with forethought, that David's letter would be the place where he arranged light into a person's life. At the teller's window, I signed the forms and felt the pen cold in my hand. Sometimes paperwork feels like the opposite of grief. It is tidy, it has rules, it has boxes that you check. Grief has no boxes. I had always preferred things with edges. David had too. The bank manager, Mrs. Peterson, led me down a corridor that smelled faintly of wax and paper. Her shoes made no sound on the carpet. Behind a glass, the vault doors opened with a groan like a chest being unlocked. They took the key and slid it into a numbered slot. The Nuttall box withdrew with the humming sound of a drawer. Inside, under the small, ordinary watch and a folded sock, was an envelope with my name in David's handwriting. The sight of his handwriting made the room tilt in an entirely different way than the number had. His letters were tidy, each a small, deliberate promise. I held the envelope for a long moment. Hands do strange things when they carry history. They can tremble, they can steady. Mine were both. Inside, there was a letter, of course. There were also bank documents folded and stapled,
a ledger of investments that totaled up to that number the lawyer had read, $185,000. There was also something else, a folder that seemed to have copies of receipts and emails, a paper trail that, when unfolded, sketched a pattern. I have to stop here, for now, because that is where the story slices into two. The envelope opened a door. What I found behind it rearranged everything. What followed were conversations and confrontations that changed the tone of a few people's smugness into something quieter, something like reckoning. I will tell you what was in the letter, what the bank document showed, and how Stephanie reacted the next time she thought she had the final say. But these things deserve a breath.
For now, imagine standing over an envelope with your son's name on it. Imagine a number, $185,000, printed in black ink that reads like armor. Imagine a stack of receipts that speak louder than any argument. Imagine holding in your hands proof arranged with care by the person you lost. Imagine the calm that rises when you know you were not forgotten. I folded the paper back and walked out of the bank with a new weight in my bag and a steadier step than I had had a week before. The motel room felt cleaner when I returned, the bedspread less like a stage and more like a place to rest. I made a list of what I would do next, not because I wanted vengeance, that is not who I am, but because David's foresight meant I had a right to be treated with dignity. There were still conversations to be had, people to confront, and papers that would make old stories look different under the light. But that box at First City had given me something more than money. It gave me evidence that love can be practical. It gave me a map through a terrain I hadn't wanted to navigate. It gave me a name written in my son's hand to carry like a charm. When I picked up the phone to call Mr. Morrison and tell him I was ready for the will reading, I felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. A sense that the next steps would be walked with eyes open. The storm hadn't passed, but the weather report changed. I think David would have liked that. He liked order. He liked a plan. He would probably have made us all sit down with a list. I drove past the house on my way back from the bank. It looked like any house in any town. Brick, modest lawn, the same mailbox my son had balanced his bills in for years. Through the window, I saw Stephanie hanging curtains that morning. She didn't see me. Maybe she thought the show was over. Maybe she thought she had rehearsed the ending. Walking away from the curb, I remembered David's laugh, his small, deliberate acts of care, and the knowledge that sometimes the most profound kindnesses are the ones that prevent cruelty before it happens. There is still more to tell. The reading of the will, the way Stephanie tried to rearrange reality to her liking, and the moment when a folder of documents made the room feel very small. But that comes next. For now, hold this. Grief can be weaponized by others, but planning can be a safeguard. Love sometimes appears as a ledger, and fortitude sometimes arrives in an envelope. I unfolded the letter in the bank like a person opening a small, private map. David's handwriting made the paper feel less like evidence and more like a conversation across a distance. He wrote to me in that mix of practicality and tenderness he always had. Reminders to water the fern, a joke about my stubborn knee, and then the things that mattered most, the instructions.
He wrote, plainly, that the $40,000 I had lent him for a down payment was to be treated as a loan, and that he wanted any proceeds from his accounts to account for that. He spelled out that some investments were designated to be used to repay me, or to be transferred directly to my name if I preferred. He asked, as he always did, that whatever was done be done quietly and without spectacle. He thanked me for the help I had given him over the years and told me to take care of myself, in the exact way only a son who had been raised by a practical, stubborn mother would know how to say it. Paper can be affectionate. Paper can be fierce. David had been both. He had left a ledger, account statements, investment summaries, printouts with balances and dates that added up to the number the lawyer had given us, $185,000. Folded beside those was a small packet of what looked like emails and text message printouts, and receipts, and a few screenshots that somehow made time look sharp and clear. I spread them on the table in the little private room the bank offered and let the facts speak for him. The investment statements showed the accounts, their numbers, the institutions involved, and the beneficiaries listed. The names were printed in official type. They were not dreams or wishes. They were designations. David's handwriting on paper. David's signatures were necessary. An amendment dated February 15th. The ledger treated relationships like arithmetic. One name,
one set of numbers, a line that balanced. Then I saw the packet of messages. They were not dramatic in the way movies make evidence dramatic. They were ordinary, and therefore damning. A message here suggested packing things up soon and not letting them sit. Another referred to clearing up old paperwork. There were notes that read like plans. We'll handle the mortgage. We'll get the house listed. And one from the cash where someone asked, "Are we sure Mom will cooperate?" The voice in that last one was short and confident. The reply, what passed through the screen as a plan, spoke in the future tense, as if strategy could make someone disappear. There were receipts, too, charges for cleaning services, movers, and oddly, purchases that didn't match what we had been told. The documents didn't shout. They hinted, the way a photograph hints at a room left midlife. They suggested a pattern, that a strategy had been unfolding in the weeks after David's death, one that translated grief into an operation of erasure. Most painful of all for me were the little annotations David had made on some pages. Loan from Mom, $40,000, in his careful hand. An account note that said, "For Mom, final arrangement." He had done the bookkeeping of his love. Standing there, with the envelope open, and the worm of anger finding purchase in my chest, I felt something else rise, gratitude that he had planned.
Gratitude is an odd thing to feel in a bank vault under fluorescent lights, but it steadied me more than the motel room ever had. This was not vindictiveness. This was the relief of a person who had been thought of, whose existence had been anticipated and protected. I called Mr. Morrison from the parking lot before I went back to the motel. I told him I had opened the box. I told him the letter had been found, and that there were documents that, if necessary, could be presented at the reading. He said quietly that the procedures would be followed and that everyone would attend to David's stated wishes. He did not overpromise. He only outlined steps: transfer of beneficiaries, account coordination, the necessary signatures. The lawyer's voice is always a little like a weather report, flat but useful. The day we scheduled the reading was for me a mixture of dread and something like calm. I wasn't hungry for a scene. I didn't want any television drama. I wanted the facts to be respected and for the small dignity David had built to be honored. Stephanie, of course, arrived in her composed way, and Marcus with an ankle of apology showing in his eyes. They had rehearsed, I think, what they would say. They expected that when the paper was read, plans would fold in the way they had imagined. We sat in Mr. Morrison's office again. The lawyer read the amendment aloud. February 15th. Names, designations. The lawyer's voice made paperweight feel like an order. He read that certain investments were to account for the $40,000 loan and that the enclosed documents in the safety deposit box were to be given to me. He then asked if I had any questions. I did not ask if anyone in the room had any conscience left. I did not ask if anyone had the decency to blush. I asked in a voice that did not wobble, "Will these accounts be transferred as the paper instructs?" Mr. Morrison explained with that regulated tone that the accounts would be handled according to David's instructions and that we would need to proceed with the institutional steps to transfer beneficiary designations and process distributions. He explained that the bank would cooperate, that forms would be signed, and that everything would be done transparently. He did not promise miracles. He simply reminded us of the weight of signatures and the law around beneficiaries. Stephanie's response to all of this was not a sudden defense of me or a display of immediate contrition. Her mouth made that professional smile that kept her features from betraying her thoughts. But in the small moments, when she shifted in her chair, when she tapped her fingers rhythmically, the performance slipped. There was a flash of reservation, the way someone recalculates a script. "Practical matters first," she said. "We have bills, we have the mortgage, we need to be reasonable." I leaned forward then, and for a moment the room contracted, as if it were a stage focused on one detail.
David knew about the mortgage, I answered. He planned for it. He corrected what I worried about. He kept his papers. The letter he wrote, he asked that I be allowed the choice, repayment of the loan or distributions that account for it. He didn't want us to fight. He wanted what was fair. Marcus tried to interject, his voice a sheepish middleman, but Stephanie put a hand on the folder in front of her like a captain claiming a map. "We can discuss this in private," she said, carefully. We did discuss it in private, only not the way she intended. I told Mr. Morrison I wanted to go to Stephanie's house for lunch. I said it simply, because I wanted the conversation to be direct and not theatrical. I wanted Stephanie to see, in her own space, the documents that made a narrative she had assumed into something else. She said yes,
It seemed like an offer, but I think it was more like a challenge. Come at noon, she said, as if the hour lent conviviality. I arrived at her house and realized how normal it looked. The same brick, the trimmed hedges, the curtains she'd chosen. When someone tries to remake your life, they still have to live in a house with the same roof. The porch had a pot of begonias. She greeted me at the door with a practiced warmth, a hand extended as if we were two acquaintances at a luncheon club. Marcus hovered in the hallway, smiling like a man who had been promised applause. The table was set for a civil meeting. Salad, tea, a piece of apple pie laid out with a care that said domestic. I sat and we shared the ritual of food because it masks things for a time. We spoke about small things at first, neighbors, the weather, a church raffle, allowing civility to settle between us. Then I placed the envelope and the folder on the table between us and let the table do the rest of the work. When I opened the folder, I did it with the anticlimactic movements of someone reading a grocery list. The receipts were there, charges for movers on a date just after the funeral, emails to a realtor listing days and a preferred quick sale, texts that referred to clearing things out so there are no complications. There was the canceled check copy showing the $40,000 I had given David years ago, with his acknowledgement on a ledger I had kept. There were the investment statements that spelled out $185,000 in accounts and the beneficiary designations David had chosen. I slid the statements in front of Stephanie first. She glanced down and narrowed her eyes in an accountant's way. Then I slid the packet of messages across. She read them, her face doing something I had not seen, the edge of panic. For a woman who had been so composed, that was the first time she looked like someone watching their house of cards tremble. "These are copies," I said. "They were packed in his deposit box. They are what he wanted me to have." Stephanie tried at first to frame them as misunderstandings. "Those texts, taken out of context," she began.
Those receipts, they are explanations for every charge. There are always explanations, even for the things that hurt. But explanations do not change paper. Paper adds up. Signatures mean something. David had written the February 15th amendment, and he had left the letter and the ledger in a place where they could not be misplaced by good intentions. I looked at her then and did something I had not allowed myself to do since the motel bedspread. I let my voice be cold in a way that was not cruel. David did not want this to be a battle, I said. He wanted to make sure I was cared for. The $40,000 was a loan I made to him years ago. He recorded it. He wanted that to be recognized. You told people you would handle it. You told the others you'd clear things up. You helped move boxes the day I left. She swallowed. Her fingers curled around the fork like a small animal trying to hide. We were trying to help, she said. The we sounded like a shield. Helping looks like tending a wound, I answered. This looked like a racing one. Marcus, who had been hovering at the edge of the table, reached for a defense about bills and the mortgage. I let him try. He said the house needed to be sold quickly, that there were expenses. I nodded. Everything he said was true in the way that facts can be true. There were bills, there were necessary expenses, but the difference was intent and record. David had accounted for those things, and he had left instruction for how to prioritize them. It was not the same as deciding, in the immediate grief, to move someone out and treat their existence as a line item. You knew there was a letter, I said gently to Stephanie. You took a photograph of that mantle the day you boxed the photo. You asked the neighbor to help make it easier. You were precise about what would go. The documents show the plan. Why didn't you tell me? Her face folded in a way that was neither confession nor denial, but a kind of thinness that comes when a rehearsed story cracks. She said finally, I thought I was doing what was best. Do what was best by whom? I asked. Silence settled like a bowl on the table. There was no grand climax, no shouting, no tears. There was only the grinding quiet of homework being corrected. The receipts and the messages had a sober knack for reducing assumptions to decimals. Stephanie's hands trembled now, and Marcus looked as if he wanted to crawl under the table. I do not like spectacle. I did not want to make a scene that would add another layer of pain where David had gone. I also did not want to be treated as a passive bystander to my own life. The letter, the documents, David's neat hand on paper, they were his last act of care. I honored him by letting those papers speak. There are procedures, I said when the room had stopped spinning. There are forms. Mr. Morrison and Mrs. Peterson will walk us through them. The accounts are designated as the amendment states.
My preference, what David wrote, was for repayment of the $40,000 or transfer as appropriate. I'm not interested in taking from you. I am interested in being given what was promised. She tried then to bargain. If you take this money, we won't be able to cover the mortgage while we wait to sell, she offered. It was less an argument than a plea. Then let's do the practical thing, I said. We consult with the bank and Mr. Morrison. We follow what David wrote. We do it quietly and without drama. We do not erase the person who raised him and lent him the money. She stared at the table. For one long moment, the only sound was the clock on the mantel.
I thought of the motel bedspread, the fluorescent lights of the bank, of the envelope with his handwriting. I thought of the many small ways he had shown his love, fixing a leaking tap, leaving a note on my bedside table, making sure my prescriptions were filled. He had always thought like someone who left markers. Stephanie's reaction then lost the sharpness of entitlement and acquired the softer edge of regret. She did not apologize properly. There was no great apology in the way movies teach, but she quieted, and that was something. She told me she had been overwhelmed, that she had thought she was helping. She said she had been frightened. Those words are not absolution, but they are human. We did not litigate at the table. We signed forms later as Mr. Morrison and Mrs. Peterson guided us through institutional formalities. There were signatures, witness lines, and the slow turning of wheels that make civil order possible. The bank required verification and forms. The lawyer required his paperwork. That is how things are set into motion, not by drama, but by lines being drawn and checked. Mr. Morrison explained the practicalities. The accounts would be distributed according to David's amendment. The $40,000 was acknowledged in his records. There would be paperwork to complete to transfer beneficiaries and to process any distributions. It would not happen in a single afternoon like a movie montage. It would happen through forms, which is to say, through patience. Mrs. Peterson was discreet and efficient, calm as a ledger, with a kindness like a bank teller's little gift. In the weeks that followed, I moved some of the accounts into my name, not in a rush but step by step, as the banks required time to verify things and the lawyer arranged her signatures. I was meticulous because David had been meticulous. I did not want to be rushed into a mistake. I watched as figures that had been just numbers on a page became a small actual cushion, not a fortune, but a safety net. The presence of the $185,000 as a set of investments was not a sensational windfall. It was a practical set of assets that allowed me to breathe without fear of being shuffled from pillar to post. What the bank documents had done more than anything was altered the tone of how people spoke to me. Where there had been an efficient, comfortable erasure, there was now an awkward, guarded courtesy. It is a strange thing to watch the arc of someone's demeanor when the ledger changes. I do not relish watching people rearrange their faces to accommodate the facts, but I am honest enough to say that it was a relief. I continued to see Stephanie in the neighborhood, at church, sometimes passing in the driveways as if the events had neatly concluded. She tried, on occasion, to be more tender in front of other people. I accepted the gestures that did not demand more than I had to offer. I declined those that sought to take back things that had been given me on paper. I refused to be humiliated again. There were moments of awkwardness, too. Neighbors who had been polite now tried to be overly helpful, as if they were making up for not intervening earlier. People brought casseroles, which I appreciated in the spirit they were given. I understand that most of the world wants to do the right thing, and many did in their way. This was not about punishing anyone. It was about reinstating a reality someone had attempted to adjust. I remember the day I opened the letter with my hands in the vault, the way his handwriting looked like a small address to the future. I remember the motel bedspread, the smell of the bank vault, the sound of the lawyer's measured voice. I remember Stephanie's composed face cracking, and I remember Marcus's apology wrapped in nervousness. I did not take joy in seeing anyone startled. I took, instead, a quiet satisfaction that David's careful mind had protected me. His planning, his amendment dated February 15th, his letter in a sealed envelope, had been an act of tenderness. He had known, perhaps before his death, what some people would do in the absence of a voice to speak for him. He had made a map. When the formalities were done, I found myself sitting in my small apartment with a cup of tea, counting the ways in which a person can be cared for after they are gone. The money, the accounts, the ledger lines, those were practical things. They paid bills. They paid the person who cut the hedges. They reserved a small piece of calm for the rest of my days. But beyond that, they signaled something else, that my existence mattered to someone who had thought to name it in ink. People often ask me now what it felt like to be vindicated. I tell them it was a quiet thing. There was no gloating. There was no grand flourish. There was only the slow return of dignity. That is a subtle power, the kind that keeps you from being erased. It does not change the fact that I buried my son. It does not reduce the hollowness of evenings that stretch long. It does, however, make those evenings less anxious. I went back to the house once, after the legal things had been arranged. I walked the rooms with a friend and lingered by the window where David used to read.
The house smelled like him, coffee grounds, a faint lemon, a subtle spice he liked on the weekends. I sat in his chair for a while and let the memories gather me like moths. I did not cry theatrically. I simply let the years speak. The final thing I want to say, and the thing I wish each person who hears this to carry, is that love sometimes arrives as preparation. We think of care as hugs and casseroles, and those are essential. But there is a different kind of care, practical, boring, unromantic, that looks like paperwork and signatures and arranging for things not to be left to chance. It is not glamorous. It is often awkward. It is at times morbid to think about, yet it is a gift. If you love someone, remind them to make a list. If you are the one who has been given a life to manage, keep your receipts, keep your emails. Do not hand over the keys to your story just because someone offers help in a loud voice. Help that is respectful asks. It does not take. And to Stephanie, I do not want to make an enemy of you. I never wish to humiliate. I only wish to be remembered. I hope in time you learn that there are gentler ways to care for people you lose. I hope you learn that grief does not give license to make others small. My son, David, left me a map. He left instructions February 15th. He left a ledger that said $40,000 was a loan, and he left investments that totaled approximately $185,000. He left a letter that told me in careful handwriting to look after myself. Those were his acts of care. The day after his funeral, when I was made to pack my life into 4 suitcases, I did not yet know that map existed, but it was there. It changed everything. If you're watching and you have been underestimated, share this. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you keep records, or if someone once assumed that because you were quiet, you could be pushed aside. Tell me that you too have been loved in the practical way, and that you will remember to do the same for someone who needs protection. She threw me out the day after my son's funeral. For a while, the scrape of that kitchen chair lived in my head like proof I had been made small. The will reading changed the sound of that scrape. It handed me back a dignity that paper can sometimes restore. And in the end, that quiet restoration felt in its own way like an answer to the prayers I'd been holding since 3:17 a.m. on that awful morning.